Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for joining us for our 16th educational webinar titled Palestine 10 Lessons from Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us for this very, very important webinar. And we're so glad to have with us our very own chairman, Dr. Hatem Bazian, who I will introduce shortly. Just want to give a little bit of context on the purpose of this webinar. So the media discourse has generally dehumanized the Palestinian struggle for justice and liberation by framing Palestinian resistance to aggression, to occupation, to apartheid and settler colonialism as terrorism. The necessary implication behind such framing is that Palestinians are non-people, and any natural impulse to defend themselves, their homes, their properties, their rights enshrined under international law is unwarranted and should not be done. So this framing essentially means that you're automatically subject to demonization just because you are Palestinian. And our very own ANP chairman, Dr. Hatem Bazian, published an article emphasizing 10 lessons learned from the recent media coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The lessons touch on various elements that we will discuss in detail throughout this webinar. And I just plucked out a small portion of his bio just so we can have enough time for this webinar and enough time for our audience to hear Dr. Hatem Bazian. So Dr. Hatem Bazian is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College. In addition, Professor Bazian is a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. He founded the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender. He's also a board member of the Islamic Scholarship Fund, Muslim Legal Fund of America, president of Dollar for Deen Charity, and chair of Northern California Islamic Council. Dr. Bazian is also, of course, a founder and the chairman of American Muslims for Palestine. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatem Bazian, for joining us. I thank you for your wonderful article, but it was still so short that I wanted to bring you on here so that we can just expound on these very important lessons that just run deep in the discourse that we see today. So I really want to just get straight to it and just go through each one by one. And I really just want you to, well, first tell me what precipitated this article. Did you see this over one day of news media? Did it take you a few days to notice the contradiction in presentation between what's happening in Ukraine versus Palestine? And then we'll get into the specifics, specific lessons that you laid out. Tfaddal.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It's good to be with you, Tariq, and for all the people that are joining us online. Really, the article was just a reaction and a response to maybe 2 or 3 days of coverage as the Russian invasion of the Ukraine occurred. The type of coverage, but also the political civil society responses was completely over the top in terms of using racial discourse, otherization to in terms of refugees, in terms of how both the Ukrainian but also other people are being represented. So in this sense, it dawned on me that what you have is really these frames that have been reactivated in terms of looking at the conflicts through a racial lens and also Eurocentric priorities, rather than, one can still express solidarity with Ukraine without having to resort to the knee-jerk reactions of racist discourse. And I followed this actually article by another piece where I say that racism in Western discourse is atmospheric, in the same way that you breathe oxygen and you engage in normative practices, that racism is in almost atmospheric in terms of how it gets to be represented, that they actually can't help it, in the same way that you're breathing oxygen. It's you breathe it, and you're also producing this type of discourse. So these two pieces are together just to look at the racial dimension of coverage of the Ukraine and the political responses to it.
And just on that point, before we get into the lessons, do you think for some media commentators that this is subconscious, that they don't even realize that the racism is actually coming out in the way that they're presenting this?
Well, I do for sure. When we talk about racism, it has been already ascribed into the subconscious of the society. And that's if we look at, again, the work of W.D. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said. Since people have consumed so much of racism as part of normative practices, that becomes the map, the mental map through which the subconscious operates, and then it gets to be produced into the conscious. That's why, again, the work on racism, we tend to focus on the conscious and not as much on the subconscious, because the subconscious is actually what regulates the conscious. So in the work of, let's say, Edward Said, he labels what's called latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism. So we could say latent racism, manifest racism. So manifest racism we tend to describe and talk about, but the latent racism, which are the layered and layered deposits that are in the subconscious, and every time that there is a circumstance, an incident, that this actually becomes the way all events and all meanings are interpreted through reference to this heavy depository of the subconscious of racism.
Okay, and I think that's a great segue to the very first lesson that you point out. So here's what you say, and I want you to just expound on it a little bit. The people of Ukraine are, quote, European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, end quote, while Palestinians are Arab and have a darker complexion. Lesson 1, empathy and recognition of pain and suffering is color-coded, and race still matters in 2022. So before you respond to that, I just want the audience to know that quote, European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, that was a statement made by Ukraine's deputy chief prosecutor, David Sakvarazadils, in an interview. So Dr. Hatem, could you please comment on that? Race still matters and suffering is color-coded.
Well, he was not the only one to have mentioned the color, the complexion, the hair type of the individuals that were facing suffering. Any human being that faces suffering is to be recognized for the suffering, and a human being should respond to it. But in here, the immediate response was that people began to make a distinction, racial distinction, between this group of people that are considered to be a superior type of human beings versus the others. And I think in a number of other statements that we begin to see that not only that they're racial features, but that these are high quality immigrants or high quality refugees, that these are middle class, these are like us. And in doing so, in essence, is resorting back to a line of demarcation of who's the human. The human, in essence, is that who is described with the superior quality of the human, meaning blonde hair, blue eyes, and so on. And those who are prescribed with the subhumanness are those of darker complexions. Saying this, that the death and destruction that have been visited on populations in the global south, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, even at the same day or the same week that Russia invaded the Ukraine, the French deployed their forces in Mali. Yet it was not a story. It is not actually because the people that are being killed or being securitized in this sense are seen to be darker complexion, so we don't worry about them. The United States also bombed Somalia at the same day and the same week during the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The Yemeni population has been decimated with the use of U.S. and European weaponry in general. So when it comes to the Palestinians, again, almost every day there is a Palestinian being shot, killed by the Israelis. There's Palestinians being, ethnically cleansed from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, in Naqab, in a number of those areas. And therefore, why is it that empathy for Ukraine is instantaneous and immediate, while empathy to the Palestinians, the Yemenis, the Syrian, Iraqis, the Africans, whether it's in the Congo or Mali, is completely erased? And this goes back to Cornel West's book, Race Matters. So race is still one of those important ingredients that we tend to actually not discuss or not to take stock of. Now, some people, again, not to use the line of argument that our previous president used, some people, but some people say, why are you stuck on race? Why do you bring race in the issues? We did not bring race into the issue. It's your, what you call atmospheric racism that produced race and produced race as a way to make demarcation between the human and subhuman. And then our critique of it becomes the problem, because we're pointing out that the emperor has no clothes when it comes to racism, and now it becomes that you are blaming the white people for what is taking place. So in this sense, again, it's damn if you do and damn if you don't in relations to this framing. So they bring race into the middle, literally. It's like you pontificated race on front of the camera with the powder on your nose, and then complaining about the fact that we're actually discussing race as it relates to Ukraine, and then demand on us, you need to show solidarity with the Ukraine without actually being a problem, right? So in here is just like almost a layered silencing of a critique that should be had, while also one can express solidarity or sympathy for individuals that are facing a foreign invasion that we are witnessing in front of our eyes.
Exactly. You should not call a spade is what is pretty much the point here. And before we move on to the second lesson, I did hear some language from some news stations making the third world versus first world distinction. That has racial undertones as well.
Everything.
You're right.
This is not Iraq. This is not Syria.
There you
this
go.
Is not like these are people like us. This is middle class. This is the quality immigrants. This is quality immigration. All these discourses are framed on the line of the human subhuman. The human is the European. The subhuman is everybody that belongs below that line. So again, this is a highly racialized framing. So again, they can't help it. Because that's what, again, in the back of their latent racism that continues to spool, and it's almost unnoticeable, especially what's his name, Dagato, who says, I am being careful in here. I'm wondering if you were not careful, what would be the result if you were not careful?
Exactly. And this goes straight into your second lesson here, which says Palestine, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, where violence is normal and death is, the quote, is baked into the culture, while Ukraine is a European city that is modern and advanced, and these things are not supposed to happen in this area. So the lesson is Western and European history is but a long series of erasures, amnesia, and deeply held views of exceptionalism. You kind of touched on that a little bit in your expansion of the first answer. But yes, I want you to really get into that. The politics of erasure and amnesia is very critical.
Yeah. Well, again, this touches on the issue of violence. That this is not supposed to happen in Europe. That this is the realm where it happens in the plantation. It happens in the third world. It happens in places where we invade and we bomb. We do carpet bombing, and it is the darker skinned people that should experience it. But actually, just to step back from this, one have to actually completely undergo a mental lobotomy in order for actually examining European history without recognizing how violent it was and continues. So much so the violence that they actually had the Super Bowl of violence, World War I, World War II. They had actually two. The one with the Holocaust as well. That's a European violent phenomena. They perfected violence, but it gets us to erasure of thinking that this did not happen in Europe. I remind you that we had the Bosnian Genocide, 1992-95, where 300,000 Bosnians were committed to genocide, including 60,000 women that were subject to rape as an instrument of war. In this sense, and if you go to Bosnia, just recently I was there, you will see the graves of those people that have been committed to the genocide, including Srebrenica, which is the massacre and the genocide of 8,000 individuals, while the European forces, the United Nations forces, was really clearly observing in there and facilitating this information. So this notion, you could only say that with a straight face if you see European history as an exceptionalist history, or Western history as an exceptionalist history. So even violence, when it is committed at the heart of Europe, the most destructive type of violence is almost completely erased, because our violence is for civilizational purposes, while their violence is genetic, right? So again, I refer back to people maybe to read Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. His chapter on violence would get us to understand this aspect relative to both colonization, but also contemporary 20th century history, that violence was an instrument that almost baked into European history, colonization history. So that's why it's very important. Individuals who are sitting in front of the camera and these politicians are shocked that this happened in Europe. You only can say that with a straight face if you have not read anything. And most likely, people who are being brought in front of the camera are being brought just because they have what you call nice features. And when you powder their noses and cheeks, they look good at the camera, but it does not indicate really a depth of reading and understanding of European history. We're not even touching European history as it impacted the rest of the world, whether it's the genocide in the Americas, colonization, the King Leopold II in the Congo, the almost 15 million that were wiped out as a result of the famine that was induced by British policy in India, the carpet bombing of Vietnam, of Laos, Cambodia. All this, we're not even touching it. Just I'm touching specifically in Europe to say that statement that this did not happen, or why it's happening in Europe. You just have not read European history, not only in history, but also contemporary. We're talking about the genocide in Bosnia, just in the most recent, what you call 2 weeks of history, when you put it in the context of 1992 to 1995.
There was even England and France fought for so long in the late Middle Ages, they even labeled it the 100 Years' War.
Well, they have the 100 Years' War, they have 30 Years' Wars. And so again, if you read European history, it is just built on war and constant engagement with warfare, fighting with one another. And even if you go to Urban II's speech to initiate the Crusades, he says we need to stop fighting each other and go and steal somebody else's land and resources. So even the Crusades as an instrument was actually born out of European context of inner fighting within European powers.
Okay, I want to move on to the third point here, because I really want to get into all 10. Your third lesson: volunteering to fight in defense of Ukraine from outside is a heroic act, which indeed it is. But volunteering to resist settler colonialism and apartheid is framed as terrorism by Western powers. So the lesson is Palestinians are demonized no matter what heroic acts they undertake.
Yeah, well, as the war in Ukraine unfolded, we saw Western media, we saw Western politicians in not only encouraging, but saying that, volunteering and supporting the Ukraine militarily. You had people that, with military training in the US, in various parts of Western Europe, volunteering and being represented, a grandpa leaving his home and ready to take on the Russians in the Ukraine. and it's represented in such a heroic act, which is, again, anyone that volunteers is, in essence, is undertaking a heroic act to sacrifice oneself for a higher cause, which is, again, in this case, a Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But when it comes to the Palestinians, everything relative to Palestine is demonized. To say Palestine, you get to be demonized. If you ask for any type of support for the Palestinians, you actually demonize. If you support the PDS, you are being demonized. If you send any donations to Palestinians, you are demonized. You have the whole infrastructure of what's called material support, which many of the Palestinians and their supporters in the US and Western Europe have been demonized and actually entangled in legal action as a result of their support of Palestinian cause across the board. Not only that, but many of the Western powers tend to actually aid and abet Israel in its demonization and in targeting of the Palestinians, sharing intelligence, sharing resources, and so on. So the Palestinians, in essence, are posited never to be heroic, never to be in the state to be heroes of their own destiny. And anybody that supports them, in essence, is supporting terrorism, and that's how it's framed. Now, in here, I have to say, when we talk about Israel as a project, Israel is both a European project and a Zionist project simultaneously. And that's why when they look at Israel and they look at its treatment of the Palestinians, they see this as a success case, and therefore they continuously aid and abet Israel in its punishment, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide of the Palestinians. So a Palestinian cannot be in the Western framework to be a hero. Palestinian actions cannot be viewed other than that it is disrupting the progressive trajectory of Western history, which unfolds through the stepping stone of supporting Israel and everything that takes place. So we could see in here, in relations to the Ukraine, you have posts on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram, actually telling, here how you build a Molotov cocktail, here how you attack a tank, here's how you actually build what you call small weapons and so on. While a Palestinian actually putting a post, free Palestine, you get the complaint, you might get a warning, or even using any type of materials on the social media space, you immediately labeled as a support of terrorism and material support, including a person who might actually have words saying supporting Palestinians by expressing rhetorically support Palestine can get you into the material support. And we have the oddity, again, for people who don't know, a singer who sings patriotic songs for Palestine is actually charged with material support. A singer who sings patriotic songs to support Palestine is actually charged with material support. So it is our right to point to this double standard that is applied in here. It's our right to say that what the Ukrainians are doing, again, anyone that defends their land and their society is heroic. Anybody that comes to support them from outside should be celebrated as a hero. And the Palestinians have actually written the book on heroism. They stood not only in front of Israel and Zionism, but in front of the British and as the superpower at the time. And now they're arrayed against Zionism, Israel, the United States, Western Europe, and increasingly the Arab Muslim Zionists who also are supporting Israel. So the Palestinians, if anything, are the real heroes that should be celebrated for their stand, both historically and the contemporary period.
And speaking of celebration, we're going to get into your next point, lesson number 4. When an officer in Ukraine blows himself up and destroys a bridge to prevent the Russians from advancing, then he is celebrated for his sacrifice. So the lesson is Palestinians are demonized for just being Palestinians, and any and all resistance is framed as terrorism. And the news has been replete with resistance language in a celebratory context, in the context of Ukraine, and it's always labeled in the terrorism context, in the context of Palestine.
Well, this is precisely the point that in the convention, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Indigenous People, one section of it spoke about the right of resistance. Both the United States and Israel opposed, with 2 other countries, only 4 countries that oppose the fundamental right of indigenous people to resist their occupiers and to resist settler colonialism. And therefore, both the United States and Israel, as well as its allies, on the one hand, celebrating the Ukrainians and their allies' rights of resistance. And if you see all the coverage, is just so rightly crafted about celebrating and looking at people resisting the encroachment and the takeover of their own land and country, while the Palestinians, no matter what, are to be demonized, including when Palestinians engage in nonviolent resistance. Again, this is not a debate about violence and nonviolence, but the PDS movement is a nonviolent movement, but it's demonized, right? Simultaneously, if you think about all the PDS supporters, the same senators, congressmen, the same political leaders in the West, Johnson and others, while they're standing opposing Palestinian PDS, they went overdrive, like from 0 to 60 in less than 1 second in adopting PDS against the Russians. And not failing to recognize that on the one hand, they oppose PDS on the Palestinians. You don't have the right even to nonviolent resistance, right? Because it's completely been demonized, while the Ukraine is completely adopted, embraced, and negating the Palestinians' rights to self-resistance. So that's where you see the double standard is so clear and so explicit that it does not even warrant for us to even go into more details to show this double standard that is applicable. More importantly, that not only that Palestinian resistance is made illegal and delegitimized, but the West actually sends the weapons to our oppressor, and they want us to accept that as being the norm. So just the most recent budget, the United States have allocated, I think it's $4.2 billion, the allocation in this coming budget for Israel. So not only that the Palestinian resistance is negated, demonized, and curtailed, but also there is an added element that the Western powers, the United States and others, are supporting Israel directly militarily. So they're not neutral on the question of the use of violence against Palestinians.
Thank you for that contextualization. And when you started talking about BDS, I didn't want you to go too far because that was your last lesson, and I wanted to leave that until the end.
Yeah, elements are connected.
Yeah. You can't. They have to overlap, of course. But okay, so we've seen this transcend just mere politics, and it entered sports culture, and that goes straight to your point number 5, which is that sports teams and famous sports figures can express solidarity and carry the Ukrainian flag, post messages on the electronic boards, and demonstrate this on the play field, which is all very positive, and players should have the right and ability to do it. However, Palestine is an exception when it comes to sports figures expressing any support for the Palestinians who are living under settler colonial occupation, structured with an embedded apartheid system of racial, religious segregation. So the lesson is, the sports administrative structure hands out fines and sanctions, red card, for anyone who expresses support for Palestine, including on the occasion of fans hoisting Palestinian flags in the stands. So speak to that sports element, that sports culture element.
Well, sport, and then also the whole arena of entertainment, famous people, and so on. You know, last year attack in late April, early May, on the 27th night of Ramadan, that Palestinians are assaulted in Al-Aqsa Mosque, bombing of Gaza on, clearly people are watching. People began to express solidarity, whether it's carrying the flags during some competition in Europe, expressing that on Twitter. And literally there was a massive administrative checkpoint by the leadership of all these sport enterprises, is not to politicize sport. That sport should not be a place of politicization. That individuals were handed fines, or they had to keep away from engaging in any type of expressions. We also saw in the social media space, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, Twitch, all these began to actually censor Palestinian stories, Palestinian posts in solidarity. Many of us witnessed the fact that Gigi Hadid and her sister were participating in a protest, and there was a whole attack on them with a full-page ad in the New York Times to try to attack their participation in such an engagement. Now compare the censorship, administrative censorship, fines that have been handed out to individuals, including the case that I'm referring to, the fans of a Scottish soccer team, who the fans hoisted some Palestinian flags during a soccer game with an Israeli team, and the European and FIFA Federation handed a fine to the team because they did not actually restrict the fans' ability to express and put out the Palestinian flags during this game. As the Russians invaded Ukraine, it's almost across the board. Soccer teams across the English league, soccer teams in the German league, in the Italian, in the Spanish league, in various here in the United States, whether it's basketball and others, all were not only players by themselves, but actually institutionally. And that's the difference between administratively and institutionally rallying and putting this positive responses and allowing people, rightly so, to express their sympathy and identification with a cause that they feel is something that impacts their human sensibilities and human response to this phenomenon. That is constantly denied to anyone that expresses solidarity with the Palestinians, be it a sports figure person, a team, a famous actor, actress, or anyone that dares to come out in expressing solidarity with the Palestinians. But now we're seeing almost like 24/7 these electronic billboards in stadiums, in arenas, reflecting sympathies, rightly so, for the Ukrainians. And more importantly, many of the media outlets are putting locations where you could donate directly to helping the Ukrainians. PayPal, again, PayPal, just remember, PayPal actually allowed for people to directly send money to the Ukrainians that are living or experiencing direct invasions of the Russians. So you could actually, under PayPal, you could say, when the Gaza was bombed to smithereens, not only the first time, but across since 2007, you cannot get a penny in. You are completely, even through PayPal and all these financial tools, you're not allowed. You actually have to go through layers and layers of restrictions. And I often say it's much easier to send money to Mars with Elon Musk than actually be able to actually send any type of support of the Gaza. And I think many of these individuals who are smart aleck, they just, got up and drank a Coca-Cola bottle. Oh, terrorism. They actually often, it's Hamas, and they confuse Hamas with hummus. And that's often their response whenever they talk about. But in general, showing and expressing solidarity with the Palestinians, it's a no-go zone, and it will get you a red card administratively, structurally, and you would become a systematic target in this sense. So this is what we are speaking about, this double standard that is applicable in relations to the sport and famous actors arena that we are experiencing.
And when I read recently that, and I want you to speak to this, thousands of Jewish Israelis, I believe that was the number, were marching in Tel Aviv with Ukrainian flags saying "Free Ukraine."
Again,
I don't know what to say.
Well, sometimes when you watch the news, you're not sure whether you're watching Comedy Central or the news. In this case, I am sure it was Comedy Central masquerading as news, because it's only in this what you call alternative universe that a colonizing settler population occupying a people and a land is protesting against a country that supposedly they are engaging in an occupation of a territory of a people and a society that they identify with. And sure enough, actually, I saw a post that many of the founders of early Zionism that came to Palestine from the top leadership, almost exclusively, or the overwhelming majority of them, come from the Ukraine, with only two actually, possibly, or three come from Poland. So because again, the Ukraine was part of Eastern Europe, and therefore early formation, and Belarus. So early formation, the majority of those who came to Palestine come from the Ukraine. And we saw some of the videos actually of Ukrainian settlers in Palestine facing off against Russian settlers in Palestine. So they're even in Palestine, they're fighting the conflict that is unfolding in between Russia and the Ukraine as we speak. But again, this is the absurdity that we are facing these days of expressing solidarity with Ukrainians, while those who are protesting themselves engage in ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and continue to do so as we speak.
Okay, point number 6. Calls for sending weapons to Ukraine so as to resist and fight Russian invasion and occupation are supported and expressed as a fundamental right for people facing such an enemy. Anyone who calls for supporting the Palestinians by sending military equipment or items to strengthen the resistance is criminalized and often imprisonment under the spacious law designation of material support. So the lesson is Palestinians don't have the right to defend themselves, but must accept to be occupied, and the world community is committed to funding and extending all types of support to the settler colonial occupier. So we can't defend ourselves. Is that right, Dr. Hatem? We just have to accept
under the current rules that has been set in relations to the Palestinians and in the world community, between two parentheses, again, the world community meaning Western Europe and the United States, and increasingly its Arab allies, a Palestinian does not have the right to defend their land, their homes, and their properties from a settler colonial power. Not only that, but actually international community and its institutions, and increasingly also Arab and Muslim states that have relations with Israel, act and work over time to make sure that they actually restrict the Palestinians' ability to resist their occupier. So not only that you don't send them weapons and don't send them support, you actually make sure that they actually don't even have the capacity to resist and engage in any form of resistance. And they have to be constantly subject to bombardment, to attacks. And much of the Palestinian Authority structure is actually targeting the Palestinian resistance. That's actually in the formation of the Palestinian Authority security services. So if we go back to even to the Oslo Accords, the police force that was set up under the Oslo Accords is actually, it is to take over the Israeli security apparatus that is directed against the Palestinians. And that's why at the time, I think Rabin says, for the first time, we have somebody to implement our security apparatus without having to actually resort to Supreme Court or bleeding heart liberals. So the structure that is imposed on the Palestinians makes it illegal for Palestinians to resist, which in contravention to the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter should say that occupied people who are denied their right to self-determination have the right to resist their occupier by any means necessary. Right? But again, we see the double standard. Overnight, shipment of all types of weapons, Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles, or shoulder-held rockets, drone equipment, all that is being sent to the Ukrainian, while the Palestinians, even if you draw a picture of a Stinger missile, might be actually charged with incitement to violence. And literally, we actually see, if you see some of the Zionists and their engagement on some of the social media, especially Canary Mission and others, a Palestinian drawing or a Palestinian photo might be used as a way to criminalize the person, and the whole campaign on campuses and others are unleashed for the Palestinian having a picture of X, Y, and Z, while an Israeli who literally shooting a Palestinian, right, is actually excused because he is defending and trying to deal with terrorism. So Palestinians are posited as being to be object of violence and never to be able to defend themselves. And that's, again, we're seeing it in the discourse relative to Palestinians almost on a daily basis.
All right. Palestinians are framed as the aggressor. The victims, the occupied people are framed as the aggressor, flipping at 180 pretty much.
Well,
okay.
Again, this is south-north type of dynamics.
Well, of course, yes. Okay, I want to get into the next one here. So lesson number 7. We're on number 7. For Ukraine, international law advocates in the Western world brought about the defense of the Fourth Geneva Convention, brushed up on definitions of war crimes and genocide, but none of this applies to Palestine and Palestinians. One can add most of the global South and the Muslim world suffer the same type of double standards when it comes to international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. If you have a doubt for a moment, then ask the Afghans, Iraqis, and Syrians on this single point, then we can have a larger discussion. So the lesson is Palestinians are made to live outside the scope of international law, and the Western world delivers the weapons and instruments used by Israel to violate the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Convention on Genocide. The Ukraine invasion made this very clear. I've never heard so much talk about the Fourth Geneva Convention the past 3 weeks, but not in the past 74 years, but definitely in the past 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, again, when it comes to international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Convention of Genocide, I think everybody should be very, very clear. If you have a doubt, maybe sit down, get a cup of coffee, tea, and just reflect upon it. Palestinians have been a primary recipient of violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention from 48 all the way up to the present. All the operations that Israel conducts, again, if somebody has resolution 181 and so on, so okay, let's set that aside for a minute. All the operation in the 1967 area is in direct contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention, building settlements, transferring civilian population, the systematic targeting of the population, uprooting trees, home demolition, collective punishment, all of this, right? The Palestinians have been subject to this massive violation. And I would add also the United States treatment in relations to Iraq, Afghanistan, but that set that aside in relations to the Fourth Geneva Convention. So Palestinians are actually not protected by the international community when it comes to the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Convention of Genocide, as well as a host of other conventions. Look at the language that have been used by President Biden and some of the Western European leaders, that immediately as Russia invaded Ukraine, they immediately used the term war crimes, right? It's and just last week when Biden was in the press conference speaking, a journalist asked him, do you think that Putin is a war criminal? He responded, yes. Now, mind you that the Israelis have used almost massive bombardment of Gaza in from 2007 all the way up to this past May 2021. The most that you actually got from the investigators, war crimes may have been committed, right? And they usually actually equate between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as if the Palestinians are equal to the Israelis, as the Palestinians have an F-16 and a 1-ton bomb that is actually comes and demolishes a whole building from top to bottom. They equate between them. And then you get the whole international community mobilizing itself not to protect the Palestinians, not to actually investigate, but actually to protect and find ways out for Israel to explain, right? It's a violation of international law. No one actually will use this violation of international law. More importantly, that Israel actually gets to be rewarded for this violation. We send them what you call the Iron Dome. We send them replacement for the rockets they fired on the Palestinians. We replace and replenish all their equipment, as well as we give them access to the forward deployed U.S. equipment that is stationed in the region, so for it actually to continue to punish the Palestinians. So all of a sudden, all these people that have been what you call possibly have not looked at the Fourth Geneva Convention on the shelf, including some of the people in here at UC Berkeley. We had a professor who wrote the memos on torture, John Yu, who actually in clear face said that the Fourth Geneva Convention is passé during the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's where he wrote his memo of the expansive new regime of torture with expanding executive authority relative to the United States. So I think what we need, Palestinians, sometimes in here maybe we could laugh. Maybe we're the only people that know what the Fourth Geneva Convention is about. Maybe we're the only people that could actually, what you call, run out Article 67, Article 48, 47, and we actually take it seriously, not actually comprehending that basically this is almost like a pastime sport for us. While the bombs are falling on us, we actually take comfort that there is a set of these international legal standards called the Fourth Geneva Convention, Convention of Genocide, that almost often is applied against us rather than for us. And more importantly, it tends to mobilize the powers of the global North against global South. Just think about how forceful the implementation of the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to Sudan or relative to Libya or relative to the Congo and so on. The only exception, again, giving reward or giving props where it belongs, the treatment of the Serbs relative to the genocide of the Bosnian. I would again give credit, just so nobody somebody who just drank maybe their espresso, all of a sudden discovering that, oh, you did not, the West have done this. Okay, I'll give you credit. 1 out of 100 does not mean equal. If you look at the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it has been used as an instrument of control and intervention of the global South. And some of the primary violators of the Fourth Geneva Convention have actually been the 5 permanent powers in the United Nations Security Council: the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China. With more, the United States has been a primary violator. Just as the question when Madeleine Albright, with a straight face, saying that there's 500 children that died in the Iraq sanctions, whether the price is worth it, with a straight face, she said that the price is worth it. That shows me that the education and the paper that she had is not worth the seed that she was representing, which she actually responded to that question. And that's still, one would ask, where was the Fourth Geneva Convention when it comes to the Iraqis, to the Afghans, to the Syrians, to the Yemenis, to the Somalis? And where is the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of all these refugees that are coming from the global South? So that's where, again, when it comes to the Fourth Geneva Convention international law, it becomes only a debating team relative to Palestine, and it does not get to be implemented or taken seriously. And for sure, Israel is never taken to task for its violation of international law, for Geneva Convention, genocide, and so on. And for sure, the treatment of prisoners relative to torture. And you get people here that can qualify to be sophisticated, stand with a straight face, say Israel does not torture. I have a bridge to sell you if you think that Israel does not engage in torture. We actually subcontracted and have actually benefited from Israel's structure of torture as well as its treatment of the Palestinians.
Yeah, and Israel has somewhat of a laughable application of the Fourth Geneva Convention in the West Bank and Gaza by the courts only stating that it would apply the so-called humanitarian provisions without defining what it actually means by that. In which case we'll apply the parts that will benefit our project, and then we'll just not apply the parts that go against it. So it's kind of a legal loophole. Yeah.
Well, Israel looks in the mirror and say, we are so great. And therefore, that's basically their epistemological treatment and engagement with the international law. Again, right. I always see it as part of a comedy show rather than being a serious engagement with international law.
And the comedy is that the Fourth Geneva Convention as a whole is a humanitarian treaty. So all the provisions are humanitarian. What do you mean the humanitarian? Like, that's why it becomes laughable. Okay, so
Yeah.
onto point number 8 regarding media coverage. So media coverage rightly focused on the victims of the Russian invasion and the human stories with people taking weapons to defend their families, homes, and cities. Palestine always faces the media coverage that amplifies, humanizes, and centers the narrative of the settler colonial occupation while erasing or often problematizing Palestinian narrative in the often deployed euphemism of death during clashes. Israel having the right to defend itself or responding to rocket firing. So the lesson is Palestinians are made to be the guilty party for wanting to live on their land and having the audacity to insist on it. The double standard and culpability of the Western world is furthering settler colonialism in Palestine. Please speak to that.
I think anyone that is watching the media coverage on the Ukraine understand how the media coverage has been uh, rightly framed in addressing the human dimension of the conflict and humanizing the victim as rightly so. Uh, the stories about the refugees, the displacement, looking at the destructions of the homes, people who are fleeing with their kids, the coverage of the hospitals and the infants that are being taken from one place to the other, narrating the stories of mothers and so on. So you actually got to see the humanity of the Ukrainians. Whenever Palestinians are framed, it's either you actually giving some of the most vicious type of coverage that are there, and you see them. They'll take some of the B-rolls that have been recorded time and time again from the past. These massive Palestinian rallying with covered faces, chanting and so on. So that gets you immediately a negative reaction. So on the one hand, you have Israeli bombs raining on apartments, and on the other, you immediately get the second or the reflective photo or pictures that are there, the B-roll that is coming with the Palestinians. In essence, it is made to rationalize the bomb. And I always say that there is a bullet and a bomb and a rocket that is fired, and then there is the media coverage of it that actually rationalize and make it to be not only the legitimate, but you need actually to send them more weapons and more bombs to be thrown. So in this sense, the Palestinians are never humanized. And I'm a very critical person when I say humanizing the human is dehumanizing as a frame. But in the media coverage in the conflict, we don't see the story of a Palestinian woman that have lost her apartment, that there was about 10 or 15 that are been in that apartment that now are being displaced. We don't follow to say what happens to their infant child that was born right there. We don't follow the story about now they don't have clean water, they don't have their any of their food, that their beds are completely been destroyed. We don't get that story. The media, the talking heads, the individuals that are covering begin to say, well, we are not sure whether this was actually a site where Hamas was in the mix of the civilians. By doing so, they immediately are taking the press release of the Israeli military, because again, the Western media is so lazy that they give a new word to laziness. They actually take the press release of the Israeli military because they often are actually reporting from the Israeli side. They're embedded journalists within the team of Israeli military press control, press management. So they immediately take that Israel said that this was a site that Hamas militants were there. And that euphemism of Hamas militant is used as a cover all. So an apartment building or a building that is actually the media center in Gaza gets to be bombed from top to bottom. Even the media itself does not say or actually challenges. And when they initially challenged, a couple of days, actually, they withdraw their challenge because Israel said that under the building, which we can't see, under the building there is a Hamas supposedly corridor, which they actually did not actually find or give us the evidence or argue in this way. So immediately, again, the humanizing takes place for the Israelis, takes place for the Israeli military. And you could actually see some of the reporters interviewing the Israeli personnel who's firing bombs on civilian population. Gaza is one of the most densely populated sites in the world. You see the Israeli military who's going out in the middle of Al-Aqsa Mosque on the 27th of Ramadan, the holiest day for Muslims in the month of Ramadan, Laylat al-Qadr, throwing stun grenades, shooting. And the discussion is about the fear of the Israeli soldier, how they are responding to the threat of the Palestinians rather than actually the Palestinians. How does a Palestinian feel? That question is never asked, right? Again, I'm reminded possibly of W.D. Du Bois. How does it feel to be a black person, right? Or the soul of the souls of black folks. In the same way, can we actually contemplate asking the question, how does it feel to be a Palestinian? How does it feel to be a Palestinian where an F-16 is bombing you day in and day out? How does it feel when the United States, Western Europeans, so on, don't ask the question how you feel, but they say, can't you feel that the Israelis have a right to bomb you? Because that's what it says, Israel have the right to defend itself, is all these Western media is saying. Can't you understand why Israel have to bomb you? Why don't you understand that Israel have the right actually to bomb every building that from top to bottom, to wipe out the Al-Qawlaq family, 23 members of Al-Qawlaq family, right? And we still have not had any type of discussions about the whole family. You have some 46 families wiped out completely from the registry of the populations in Gaza. So the media, in essence, humanizing the perpetrator or victimize the victim again. It's easy to see that in here the media, in essence, is reloading the weapons and reloading the rockets, reloading the airplanes, reloading the bombing that is to be directed at the Palestinians. And in doing so, they have culpability. They're complicit because they rationalize the death of people that should not be killed, and also rationalize lack of investigation of the fact that these are individuals that are being killed and shot on a daily basis. And I'm not even touching the whole sniper infrastructure, where you actually a sniper behind a wall sniping at the Palestinians, and we actually express sympathy to the sniper rather than the Palestinian kids who are in the streets. Their legs are being shot, their eyes are being shot, their shoulders, their key organs. We actually, in the media, it's framed, how does it feel to be a sniper shooting at a civilian and the trauma you go through? Do you see the absurdity? Do you see the, not even double standard is almost a clean version of understanding what the Palestinians have to go on a daily basis?
Absolutely. And just as you mentioned earlier regarding sports figures, athletes, and them getting into the fray, educational institutions and the hypocrisy in the framing of their involvement was also visible here. And that's point number 9. Educational institutions across the Western world express solidarity with Ukraine. Again, rightly so, when the people face an invasion. But last April-May period, Israel launched a massive attack on the Palestinians on the holiest night of Ramadan, 29th night of Ramadan, Laylat al-Qadr, as you mentioned, then followed by a massive bombardment of Gaza. When faculty members, departments, and students at universities expressed solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, a steady stream of political figures, university presidents, and media figures insisted that colleges and universities should not be politicized, and to make sure that their internal policies prevent them from expressing such solidarity positions. So the lesson is that Palestine on college campuses always meets the administration, Zionist and settler colonial checkpoints that are structured to prevent solidarity with Palestinians. So even hypocrisy in the realm of education and educational institutions.
You know, on college campuses, almost on a daily basis, without exception, there are statements that are issued from faculty members, students, organizations, faculty for support of, the freedom of birds to fly wherever they want, the freedom of this, the rights of, almost without exception, on a daily basis, I receive maybe 5, 6, maybe sometimes 10 petitions, statements of solidarity, statements of support for X, Y, and Z. when it comes to Palestine, the university apparatus and infrastructure is mobilized to restrict the right of the Palestinians and their allies to express normative practices on college campuses. And therefore, as a result of both last year, but even before in relation to other statements, you will get the university mobilizing what I call is university checkpoints, administrative checkpoints, to curtail the ability of faculty to express solidarity, to actually put tremendous pressure on department chairs that they are violating their contractual agreement. They're violating the charter of the university, that they should not be engaged. So much also to remove the department name, department titles, that you could actually only list it in your own individual name, but not in any way identify with the college university. While in almost many of the instances, there's no question whatsoever. More importantly, many of these departments have direct relations. Some other parts of it have direct relations with Israel. They have these what you call study abroad program sending with Israel, or a program that send journalists where you actually are part of this program that have this sending journalists to understand Israel. You have all kinds of science relations, right? And they often actually express support and sympathy and solidarity with Israel in these statements. And then most often the university itself, almost whenever there's an issue, they express, almost go proactively expressing support and distancing themselves from anything relative to Palestine and Palestinians. So we saw this. There's actually still right now debates across the state of California and many colleges and campuses that express solidarity with the Palestinians. There's a whole discussions and debate of what are the parameters, and that is to be acceptable and not acceptable when it comes to expressing solidarity and condemnations for things that are so clearly to be recognized as subject to condemnation. The clear violations of bombings and killings that occurred during this past May. So this is again the double standard, and now universities are putting all these statements on the landing page of the university, linking you up to donations places and so on. Again, human response to a crisis that is denied to the Palestinians, and usually the university almost proactively identify and coordinate its position with Israeli supporters, and sometimes directly with the Israeli consulates against the best interest and the ability of their own students, faculty, and staff expressing solidarity with Palestinians.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just a whole lot there, but for the sake of time, I really want to get into that last lesson, and then so that we can conclude. The BDS movement for Palestine began in 2005, but in mainstream circles, I have not heard BDS more than I've heard in the last 3 weeks. And your point is that the push for boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Russia are moving faster than the speed of light, and often by the same set of characters that pushed for legislation to criminalize and punish the Palestinian BDS movement, Illinois being one example, actually. So the lesson is, Palestine faces the constant double standard on the BDS front, free speech and constitutional rights. No clear evidence of double standard than to listen to the same individuals and groups who are now on the front line of seeking legislation to authorize BDS efforts directed at Russia, while on record opposing the Palestinian BDS movement. And I just would like to note before you comment, Dr. Hatem, is that the Massachusetts governor, Charlie Baker, issued an executive order imposing sanctions on Russia in an effort to maximize the effect of the federal sanctions against the Russian government. And I believe 11 other governors followed suit to push for this agenda. We've been fighting so hard on the B and D front, we have not gone to the S front. It took Russia 2 weeks, and the whole world is galvanizing behind this, especially here in the US. Please speak to the hypocrisy on BDS.
One is an issue of law, right? in the sense that the pro-Israel activists, whether without trying to promote their names, but the pro-Israel activists, with coordination with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, made sure to try to work to demonize PDS, and to also to say that it's illegal to engage in PDS, and that's why this use of legislation across many states, I think approximately 34 states, but I might be mistaken on the numbers, to use legal measures to restrict the ability of individuals to engage in the PDS. These legislations, including a case in Arizona, which I was one of the people that took the case to court and won against the state of Arizona, where if you have a contract with a state, you cannot have a contract while you're engaging in PDS with Israel. Now, interestingly enough, at the time that the Arizona state passed its legislation, it actually was boycotting California. So on the one hand, you could boycott another state in the union, California, while prohibiting your own citizens from boycotting a foreign country. Now, again, we don't want to say that logic is being taught at universities or that logic is in abundant supply. But when it comes to this PDS, and again, it's saying that Americans don't have the right to engage in PDS when it comes to Israel and instituting legislations in there. While in relations to Russia and Ukraine, the same individuals, the same states, the same legislatures who were pounding the pavement against the PDS when it comes to Israel and Palestine, overnight, possibly, they went to a bar and got a drink, and therefore reversed their mental frame, or possibly maybe it was a heavy meal. So all of a sudden, the next day, they became the celebrated figures in embracing a PDS movement relative to Russia. Right? Not only PDS boycott, divestment, but immediate sanctions. Right? We have been in boycott. We have some divestment, but for sure we have not yet been in the sanction arena. Which tells us again that when it comes to Palestine, everything relative to Palestine is exception to norm. It's exception to norms, exception to treatment, and political figures, media figures, university figures, all individuals who are within the scope of civil society treat Palestinian and Palestine as a distinctive, exceptional to the norms that apply to the society in general in issues relative to PDS, but also in other issues. Now, in here, I don't want to make the Palestinians the only unique. The other communities, if you talk about the Latino populations, they will involve in a unique circumstances relative to immigration, the Black community relative to policing and so on. But when it comes relative to PDS and the treatment of Palestinians within the United States, just an enormous exceptionalism. And the double standard is so clear with the PDS that it just, you can't but point out to this contradiction.
Yeah, and here, before we conclude, there's a lot of whataboutisms when it comes to BDS vis-a-vis Palestine. Well, hold on a minute. You can't isolate Israel. Why aren't you focusing on China? Why aren't you focusing on Syria? Why are you only focusing on Israel? But now you hear in the media that it is absolutely the right thing to do to isolate Russia. They actually use the word isolate. We must isolate Russia.
For those who
I think that's comedy too, right there.
For those who defend Israel, let me point out that AIPAC and the mainstream of the Zionist Jewish establishment has been constantly pushing and have been instrumental in the sanctions against Iran. It played a major role in the sanctions relative to Sudan. They have lobbied and have pushed during the Muammar Gaddafi's period in Egypt for sanctions against Libya. So in this sense, if you mention whataboutism, why is it that it's acceptable to have sanctions against all these different states, while Israel should be the protected exception to adhering and demanding certain rights and procedures relative to the United States? So in that sense, whataboutism is actually more on their side rather than on our side to respond to this. So if you think that your political priority of protecting Israel involves having sanctions on Iran because it's engaged in nuclear development, well, whataboutism relative to Israel having close to 400, possibly 600 nuclear warheads per the release of Sununu at the time, or in relation to their nuclear program. Iran is a signatory to the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is not a signatory to the NPT. So again, if you want to talk about whataboutism, we have so many whataboutism that we could fill many pages and it comes in there. And often when you get to PDS, I say they immediately actually pull the red herring. More importantly, they point to some of the Gulf states. Again, they are your buddies. You have actually a closer relationship with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Why don't you actually go and talk to them, since you seem to have interest in economic, political, athletic, and sport relations? Why don't you actually talk to them about their record rather than what about for us who really don't have the formative relationship that you have, especially some of these establishments today that running around the world promoting the Abraham Accords as it's the second coming of Abraham relative to protecting the interests of Israel as we speak.
I want to just say to the audience before we wrap up here is that this is a very, very serious topic, but because the hypocrisy is so blatant that it's just naturally comical at this point. When you see the hypocrisy laid out, I mean, you just can't avoid it. You're left speechless.
It's laughable.
Right.
I wrote another piece that just came. I put it out a couple of days ago. The happiness index, like the World Happiness Index came out. Israel is number 9. It's the 9th happiest place on earth, and then the Palestinians are 122nd. The criteria and the discussion is so laughable, right? In essence, you come and say that the Palestinians have happiness deficiency syndrome. If you're living in a settler colonial apartheid structure, you should have a happiness deficiency syndrome. And I gave 5 different ways that Israel could contribute to improving the Palestinian happiness, improving possibly to number 9, or overtaking Finland, which is the number 1 happy country in the world. Maybe Israel can come up with what you call a new happiness surveillance program. So it would surveil where the Palestinians are not happy and maybe help them become more happy. Or maybe they could send us, since it's the startup country in the world, they could send Palestinians in the occupied territories in the Gaza a happiness kit. Here's a package. It's called happiness kit from Israel, rather than sending us bombs, sending us assassination squads and all that. So again, literally, it's sometimes like you sit and look at the different Palestinian. I would say a part of us is that we have been what you call able to deal with the reality, and sometimes part of dealing with the reality is to laugh at it.
Right.
And laughing at the reality is part of dispossessing the reality, impacting on you, that it is what you could say, it's this type of response to the reality that we are facing.
Dr. Hatem Bazian, I can spend hours with you. Thank you for taking the time, and I want to thank the audience for being present. We have no time for questions. I'm glad we got through all 10 lessons. Again, Dr. Bazian, thank you for your time, and thank you for your insight, and thank you for another successful webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Have a blessed night. Salam.
When a person makes dua, when they supplicate at the breaking of their fast, that is a time of an accepted supplication. The supplication of the one who is oppressed is also a dua that is an accepted supplication. SubhanAllah, I can't think of anything that is more emblematic of capturing our connection to our brothers and sisters in Palestine when we're breaking our fast than making sure that we don't use the dates of their oppressors, because that is a contradiction in and of itself. When we talk about the success and the ethics of boycotting these products that are coming from these illegally occupied territories, we have to make it as personal as possible. And so this is a project that has a large scope, but this is also a project that is deeply personal. And so I want to encourage everyone, inshallah ta'ala, to please participate in this boycott campaign and show your solidarity with your brothers and sisters as you pray for them and you break your fast with dates that do not harm them.